There are plenty of great video game openings out there. The revolutionary, the awe-inspiring, and even the incredibly cheesy. And then there's Control. Control's first few minutes are without doubt a far more reserved affair than some, but they're also some of the most unnerving. The game does a brilliant job of introducing players to its weird and wonderful world in a gripping, but also understated manner. So for the next few minutes, I want to spend a little bit more time examining some of the details which I think make Control's intro such an impactful, and perhaps most importantly, fitting introduction to its world. Before we get cracking, please note that there will be some light spoilers which I'll warn you of in advance, and as always, if you enjoy the video, do consider subscribing to the channel as well. Now, if you're at all familiar with the kind of worlds Remedy has previously built in series like Max Payne or Alan Wake, you'll know that they're a developer which has something of a liking for creating strange, bordering on esoteric universes. And Control is no exception to this rule, kicking things off with a monologue delivered by heroine Jessie Faden. The way this monologue begins with Jessie's opening line of,
"Fair warning. This is gonna be weirder than usual. Can't be helped. You called me, so here I am."
and reference to events outside the player's experience infers that this is a story which has already begun, one in media res, and the tone of the dialogue, bleak and sombre, combines with images of the unassuming oldest house, the muted colour palette and the lack of music to evoke the feeling that the story so far has not been an altogether happy one either. Jessie continues to speak of a room, a poster on one of its walls, and how the world is so much bigger than one might imagine. At the same time, shots of paintings within the oldest house appear on screen, and comparisons are even made to the prison movie, known to most as The Shawshank Redemption, and the tunnel hidden behind a poster in Andy Dufresne's cell, which he uses to escape to freedom. What Jessie is alluding to here is that the room she's describing is the world as we know it, or in Shawshank terms a prison cell, and the poster, whether it's on a wall in Jessie's room or displayed in a prison cell, is the means of escape, the entrance to a much wider world. Shots of the paintings within the oldest house during the intro then carry with them the implication that the way to access whatever lies behind the metaphorical poster is most likely hidden behind a physical one within the building's walls. Next, the camera focuses in on a painting of Artie, the Federal Bureau of Control's janitor, and try to remember this image and the idea of escape through posters if you can, as it's one we'll be revisiting very shortly. The final shot before players take control of Jessie frames her against the outside world with an exit sign directly above her. This is a visual metaphor for the idea of the room and the poster she spoke of earlier, and the implication is clear. By entering the oldest house, home of the Federal Bureau of Control, Jessie is leaving the room, the world as we know it, and is about to find out exactly what is behind the poster. And then, events transition from the relatively strange to the relatively normal. Moving from the surreal to the sedate so suddenly does a job all of its own. It's jarring, and it really makes it hard for players to relax in spite of the mundane surroundings they find themselves in. There's a feeling that something isn't right, an undertone that regardless of the normality presented at surface level, something strange is happening, which is emphasised almost immediately by the fact players can look up at the plaque above the front desk and experience a similar effect to that used during the previous cinematic as Jessie delivered her monologue. Exploring the lobby of the oldest house, the first of many, many notes scattered throughout Control is found by a metal detector. The prohibited items list starts uninterestingly enough, listing items one would perhaps expect not to be allowed within a government building, such as weapons and certain electronic items, before it begins to get a little strange. A number 2 pencil, for example, is an innocuous object by anyone's standards, but they're not allowed into the bureau. Likewise, any objects considered to be an iconic representation of an archetypal concept, such as rubber ducks or ketchup bottles, are also prohibited. And this note is a great example of that understated weirdness I mentioned earlier that makes this intro such a joy to play. The note is weird, it's definitely weird, but it's not weird enough that alarm bells start ringing quite yet. At least some of it is relatively normal, and the unusual stuff that is there relies on the implication, rather than any particularly concrete information about the issues the Bureau may have had with rubber ducks and ketchup bottles. It's a great way of continuing to nurture that eerie undertone, and in its own way, it also acts as a little teaser, as you may well come across an object or two listed on that note a little later into the game. The next thing most players will probably stumble across are the monitors in the office next door. The two messages on the middle monitor regarding multiple containment breaches and multiple building shifts raise a fair amount of questions all on their own, with the message about building shifts proving to be especially important in the short term, but it's easy to miss the importance of what's written on one of the other monitors. The top screen mentions both an internal lockdown and a building lockdown being in effect. For those not paying too much attention, the significance of those two messages may pass them by, but for those who are, it's another great example of the way the world of Control subtly hints at something strange happening. Okay, granted, huge red words on the screen can't be considered that subtle, but do remember after all that we've just seen Jesse enter the Bureau without any issues whatsoever, which raises an interesting question at this early stage. How or why was Jesse able to enter the oldest house in the first place? Heading upstairs, players might notice that the security cameras seem to be following their every move, before finding another fairly innocuous room housing a number of pneumatic post tubes and another note. This one details second quarter expenditure for the Bureau's executive sector, and much like the list of prohibited items, it seems mundane at first glance. However, Remedy this time throws in a few redacted items to continue drilling home to the player the idea that this is a place of secrets, a place where not everything is transparent. With the previous note, it was the questions around rubber ducks and ketchup bottles, but here, it's questions around what's not in the note. After moving past a trio of paintings featuring important characters first seen during the opening cinematic, including the one of Artie the janitor I asked you to remember earlier, which features a plaque below it reading "Our Bureau at Work," players find themselves in a corridor surrounded by a set of quite normal-looking offices. At this point, Jessie's internal monologue mentions that she's been looking for the Bureau for years.
Federal Bureau of Control. All these years I've been looking for them, and they were hiding in plain sight.
And, like the lockdown messages on the monitor downstairs, this will come off as somewhat strange to the attentive player. After all, the intro showed quite clearly that the Bureau is located on a busy street, and so the fact it's been so difficult for Jessie to locate it simply doesn't add up. Before exploring further, it's worth noting that even in this hallway alone, there's a wonderful attention to detail which does so much to help make the world of Control feel consistent and believable, even mere minutes into the game. On the notice board, there's a list of office rules of conduct which mentions not using the photocopier for personal projects, or, according to the handwritten notes next to it, a 3D printer or even Bureau stationery either, another allusion perhaps to the issues around items such as the number 2 pencils mentioned earlier. Again, Control strikes a fine balance between the normal and the abnormal. More traditional notices for things like a book club, a guitar for sale, or allergy warnings help make things seem weird, but not too weird. A particular favourite of mine is the note about food tending to vanish from a certain break room, because it's unclear whether this is down to a hungry employee or the building itself playing tricks. That could well be the case, given the note about house shifts and the post-it notes stuck to it suggesting that it's a problem that has become more severe over time. And not too far from the notice board, there's even a vending machine filled with non-branded snacks, another fantastic tie-in to the prohibited items list which warned of iconic representations of archetypal concepts. Removing the branding on items in the machine would go some way to eliminating the risk around that concept. Exploring the offices themselves, they're pretty much exactly what you'd imagine government offices to look like, and aren't overly interesting in and of themselves, but there are another couple of notes here which continue adding flavour to the world. One of them is an R4 report, which is not that exciting beyond it being used as an opportunity to familiarise players with the names of characters they'll become better acquainted with in the not-so-distant future. The second note, on the other hand, is brilliant. It seems to be some kind of warning, is heavily redacted, and speaks of an incident involving a shark, ending ominously with the order of shoot to kill. I know I've mentioned it a million times at this point, but the contrast between the bizarre, in this case the note about the shark, and the dull, in the form of the office, paints a wonderful contrast that is so pervasive throughout Control as a whole. After finishing their search of the offices, players meet Artie in the flesh for the first time, and it's safe to say that much like the rest of what's been experienced so far, he's a little unusual. We'll jump back to exactly what he says in a moment, but my favourite part comes immediately after Jessie finishes her conversation with him.
I've done enough night shift loner jobs to know it makes us come off weird. Artie the janitor is a friendly face in my book.
Better than somebody with no face at all. Think about it. No face.
But that said...
Yes, that was Artie actually responding to Jessie's inner monologue, which of course he shouldn't have actually been able to hear. Moving forward to find what looks like the portrait corridor visited previously, except with an elevator in the place of Artie's portrait, I think the implication even at this very early stage is quite clear. Artie himself is intimately tied to the oldest house, and his portrait is essentially the poster Jesse spoke of earlier, the passage to the wider world. I also want to warn you that there will be a spoiler or two from this point on, so please continue watching at your own discretion. Now, there's a belief amongst many that Artie is a representation of a Finnish god, which is a reasonable assumption to make given the evidence presented during the rest of Control. However, I think this intro gives you all the information you need to come to another conclusion prior to that, and it's done in such a way that all the hints could be thought to mean something else entirely, which is frankly fantastic. The first clue is what's written on the plaque below Artie's portrait I touched on earlier, "Our Bureau at Work." On the one hand, this is stating the obvious. It's a janitor, an employee of the Bureau, at work, and the R is a collective one, referring to the staff of the Bureau as a whole. Or the R Bureau could be referring to Artie himself, implying that he is a personification of the oldest house itself, or is the being who is bound to it, much like Jessie binds herself to different objects throughout the game. Take a look at what he says to Jessie.
There you are. You are here about the job. Janitor's assistant.
Like the plaque, at surface level, janitor's assistant could mean exactly what you'd think, that the Bureau is looking for another janitor to assist Artie. Nothing too strange so far.
You need to go to the interview. Go that way to the elevator.
Thanks. Elevator that way. Got it.
Very good. I'm Ahti, the janitor, by the way. You'll work for me. You can say I sent you. If they don't hire you, niin Johan helvet. There be work for the axe. Take them behind the sauna, jumalauta.
Again, the interview could also be exactly what you think it is, an interview for a janitor's assistant role. But I don't think it is. I think Artie is referring to what happens shortly after, and the process to see whether Jessie is fit to become the next director. And, as mentioned, the elevator Artie points to appears in place of his portrait, carrying with it the implication that he's responsible for allowing Jessie further access to the oldest house. If Jessie gets the role of director, then she'll be working for Artie, and in her own way will still be doing the role of a janitor's assistant, except instead of mopping floors or emptying bins, she'll be cleaning up the hiss. It's my belief that while Artie is not responsible for the choice of director, he effectively uses that person as a means of keeping the oldest house in check. Whether he is the house, as possibly implied by the R Bureau line, or is bound to it in some way, acting as its custodian, is never made clear, but the beauty here is that there's enough information given to players for them to very quickly begin theorising without anything being made too obvious at such an early stage. Like many gamers, if there's one thing I hate missing, it's a collectible, so the first thing I did upon discovering the elevator was attempt to retrace my steps back to the entrance to ensure I hadn't missed anything. Except, you can no longer go back where you came from. Where once was a hallway leading to 3 portraits, there is now only a dark dead end, with no way of accessing what was there previously. Given that this happens immediately after speaking to Artie, the game is clearly trying to tell you that it's him that's changed the layout of the oldest house, presumably in order to push you in the right direction. Remember the building shifts alluded to earlier on the monitors and the poster? Well, you've just witnessed one for yourself. I love this. It's easy enough to notice, but also easy enough to miss. And again, it adheres closely to what was seemingly Remedy's design philosophy during this introduction. There's a lot to discover if you look closely enough, but you do need to be attentive. Retracing their steps back to the elevator, players will also notice at this point that it looks as if the entire lobby of the building has moved from one place to another. But there is still one more note to find too. If players head all the way back down to the front desk, an entirely new room has appeared which houses another note. This one continues to play on the idea that the oldest house isn't the easiest building to find despite being situated on a busy street, and also the theme of suspicion and distrust of what's in front of you, which is perfectly understandable given what the players themselves had just witnessed firsthand. At this point, there's nothing left for players to do other than to take the elevator deeper into the oldest house, concluding what I consider to be the game's opening. And what an opening it is! Between the subtle clues littered throughout, the mix of strange and unusual imagery, the little details, and the requirement that players be at least somewhat switched on if they're to get the most out of it, what you get with Control's first few minutes is a masterclass not only in building suspense, but of acclimatising players to the atmosphere of the game as a whole. In just 5 to 10 minutes, Control has begun building its world with a confidence so rarely seen in big-budget releases, which so often rely on crescendos and explosive moments rather than subtlety and attention to detail. If you've played the game before, you'll know there's plenty more of this to come, and for players experiencing it for the first time, it's a wonderful taster of what the rest of the game has to offer. I'd never advise buying a copy of a game to purely play its introduction, but with Control, I'm not far off doing that, because even if the rest of the game doesn't end up quite being your cup of tea, you'll have experienced an introduction that I believe is truly, truly special. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, do consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.